Welcome to Deviance and Social Control. What we're going to do in this class is take a look at bad behavior from a sociological point of view. Now, a sociological point of view departs a little bit from the common sense view, or the view that is put forward by the people who are most in charge of handling bad behavior in our society, and that's the police and the criminal justice system. And what we're going to do to start things off is look at the logic and the philosophy that undergirds the common sense view, or the view of the criminal justice system. And we're going to examine it from a sociological perspective. And what we're going to see is that while this view is useful and it has a lot of explanatory power, it's a little bit incomplete. There's more to the story. And so in this first episode, let's take a look at why it is that the criminal justice system operates the way that it does with respect to bad behavior. And let's see what kinds of assumptions about human nature and what motivates people are inherent in this common sense view, sometimes called the classical view, sometimes called the rational choice view, sometimes called deterrence theory. The logic that undergirds the criminal justice system, or the common sense view of deviant behavior and of crime, comes from a set of philosophers called social contract theorists. And these philosophers were writing in the 17th century. Now, that's a long time ago, but the ideas that they wrote about are still relevant today. One of the most important philosophers of this time was a guy named Thomas Hobbes. In fact, Hobbes may be one of the most important philosophers you've never heard of. And Hobbes was concerned with how order is possible in cities. Now, think about the times. When Hobbes first started writing, almost everyone lived in villages, and Europe at the time was writing in England. Europe at the time was a patchwork of villages, almost all of which were involved in agriculture. Almost everybody was some kind of farmer or rancher. And so everybody lived in homogeneous villages where everybody was related to each other, had some sort of clan affiliation, and everybody knew everybody personally. Now, in a setting like this, you really don't need police because village-level societies govern themselves, because everybody knows everybody, everybody's obligated to everybody, everybody's very concerned about their reputation. There really is no way to hide because everybody would be able to identify you immediately. So the village was a very all-encompassing, homogeneous, socially dense kind of environment, and you didn't need the police. But when Hobbes was writing, people were starting to move into the cities, and you have sort of the first major metropolitan areas starting to emerge in places like London and Paris. And Hobbes wondered, how is it that order can be maintained when everybody is a stranger to each other? When people aren't personally obligated, when people don't know each other personally, how is it that we still live together more or less harmoniously? I mean, think about it. If you go out and transact commerce in this town, what you're going to find is that almost everybody you interact with is a stranger. The teller at the bank, the person who is the cashier at the grocery store, the nurse that you see at the doctor's office, almost everybody. And yet we know how to act, we know how to behave, even though we don't have any obligation to one another. And Hobbes thought this was an important problem. How is it that order is maintained in cities? And Hobbes worried about this because he had a particular idea about human nature. Hobbes believed that people are hedonistic and depraved by nature. People are self-serving, that people are in it for themselves, and that if you let society just unfold without some sort of mechanism to control people, they would destroy themselves in their greed. The exact words that Hobbes used was that society would be a war of all against all, and that life would be, as he puts it, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, Hobbes' view on human nature, you can sort of see where he's coming from if you observe toddlers. I mean, think about the way that toddlers behave. If they don't get what they want, they scream and throw a tantrum. They'll swing and hit you. They're little barbarians that we have to socialize into adults that can function in society. Hobbes says that this is our nature. And so how is it that we have civilized ourselves? And what Hobbes says is that in order for people to survive around strangers, in order for the city to exist, people have to make a sort of social contract. And this is the root of social contract theory. And Hobbes was the first and maybe the most important social contract theorist. And what Hobbes says is that we voluntarily give up some of our freedom so that we can be safe. Now, that's an odd idea, don't you think? If I asked you what the opposite of freedom is, most people would say bondage. But what Hobbes says is that the opposite of freedom is safety, and that we willingly give up some of our freedom so that we can be safe, and that freedom and safety are pulled. Now, it might be hard for Americans to admit that they're willing to give up some of their freedom, because we like to think of ourselves as a free society. But we have limits on our freedom, and almost everybody agrees to limits on our freedom. And all you have to do is ask yourself what it would be like to live in a society that was completely free. Completely free. What would a society like that be like? Well, it would by definition be anarchy. And what happens when people who are depraved and hedonistic by nature are completely free? Well, if it isn't nailed down, they'll steal it. I mean, there's no law against it. If you're upset, you can resort to violence. Even basic things about our society demonstrate this notion that we willingly give up our freedom. It sucks to try and find a parking place when the parking lot is full, or when there are sort of VIP spots to park, but everything else is clogged, or you're having difficulty. But think about what society would be like if there were no laws against parking. I mean, surely we'd like to pull up right to the front door of Publix and just get out of our car and go in. But if it was legal to do that, when you went to do that, somebody would probably already be there. And the parking lot would be even more clogged than it is now at rush hour. Or we might complain about speed limits and think that the speed limit is too slow. But wouldn't want people to be able to drive through residential neighborhoods going 80 miles an hour when children are playing. So we wouldn't want to live in a society that's completely free. And there's hardly anybody who would say, even the most hardcore libertarian would say, yeah, there need to be limits on what people can do. But by the same token, we wouldn't want to live in a society that was totally safe. I mean, how would you make society totally safe? The only way to do that would be to have a totalitarian state. Like, let's say that there is a rash of burglaries in Jacksonville, and I'm the king of Jacksonville, and I say, look, these burglaries are getting to be a problem, and so we're going to implement 10 p.m. curfew, and anybody that's out after 10 p.m. is subject to arrest, unless you have a permit. Well, that would definitely cut down on burglaries, I suppose, but we wouldn't go for that, because we want to be able to move around anytime we want. Or imagine if I said, in the interests of safety, the police can enter your home anytime they want for any reason and search your house or your person anytime they want for any reason. Most people wouldn't go for that. They wouldn't go for the Fourth Amendment, so that the police could stop you in your car and search your car without any probable cause at all. But if the police could do that, it would certainly make things safe. And so when we trade safety for freedom, we have to strike out this sort of balance. And we want to be relatively free. But of course, the freedom that allows me, for instance, to expect privacy when I email pictures of my children when we're on vacation to my siblings, I expect that no one can look in those emails and see those. But the expectation of privacy that I enjoy is also afforded to a criminal who can send illegal images through email. And if there's no probable cause to look, then no one will look. Or imagine that I want to be free to go to the ATM at 4 o'clock in the morning and withdraw money. I want to go to the Waffle House. Well, the freedom that allows me to do that also allows someone to be free to hide in the bushes, to rob me. If there's no curfew for me, there's no curfew for that person either. So when we grant people freedom, it's a virtual certainty that some people are going to abuse that freedom. So the problem becomes for Hobbes, how do we stop relatively free people in a society where people are essentially strangers to each other from committing crime? If you want to be relatively free, and that's where you want to set the social contract, and people are going to live in cities, what are we going to do to make sure that there is order? To answer this question, we're going to turn to a guy named Cesare Beccaria, who was an Italian philosopher. And Beccaria is considered to be one of the founding fathers of modern criminology. And the book that he wrote, that you can see the cover here too in Italian, was called On Crimes and Punishments. And Beccaria was deeply influenced by Hobbes. And he argued that human beings operate on what he called the pleasure principle, that whenever people are faced with a decision, they want to make a decision that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain. Right? They sort of do a cost-benefit analysis when they approach any kind of decision, whether they want to buy something, whether they want to go somewhere, whatever they want to do. They think, okay, what are the pros and what are the cons? And the idea is if the pros outweigh the cons, you're going to do it. And if the cons outweigh the pros, you're not. It's an idea of rational choice. And the decision to commit crime is also a rational choice. The reason some people commit crimes is because the pleasure of committing crime outweighs the pain, or the benefits outweigh the cost. Now, what are the benefits of committing crime? Well, it's easy to see the benefits of shoplifting, right? You get stuff for free. That's a benefit of crime. And what are the costs of something like shoplifting? That is the essence of Beccaria's philosophy of criminal justice, this idea of costs and benefits, and it is a sort of hint for how he thinks the crime problem can be solved. All right. So let's recap. Recall that for Thomas Hobbes, a problem that needed to be explained is how people can come together and live more or less harmoniously in cities, in large state-level societies, when they're not personally beholden to one another like they are in the village. And this was a problem for Hobbes primarily because he believed that humans were by nature selfish and greedy and in it for themselves, right? How do you get all of these people who are in it from themselves to come together and live more or less harmoniously? And for Beccaria, who was interested specifically in crime, how do you get relatively free people to refrain from criminal activity? We don't want to live in a totalitarian state, but to the extent that you grant people individual liberty, some people are going to abuse that liberty and use it to commit crime. So how can you stop them from doing this? And the idea, he asserted, was that the costs of crime have to outweigh the benefits. And for him, the costs of crime are raised by applying punishment. That punishment is the cost of committing crime, and that government would levy these punishments against criminals. And he argued that effective punishment That's punishment where the pain of punishment outweighs the pleasure of crime. Effective punishment has three characteristics. First, he said that effective punishment is swift. It has to be closely associated with the act. That you do the crime and the punishment inevitably follows. And anybody who has trained a dog can understand this. If you're potty training a puppy, you know that you have to apply praise or apply punishment when they are going to the bathroom right at that moment. If the dog, you watch a puppy, and if it sniffs around like it's about to poop and starts to squat, you grab it, no, 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 and then you hurry outside and you put it outside, and when it poops, yeah, 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 you give it praise, right? That's how you potty train a dog. You instill in it the notion of what's proper and what's improper while the dog is in the act. If you come home from work and you see a cold turd on the carpet and you spank your dog, you're doing it wrong, because a dog doesn't associate the cold turd with pooping on the carpet. It has to be at the moment that the dog is going to the bathroom. Well, humans are a little more complex than dogs, but the principle is the same. That the punishment has to be associated with the act in the mind of the offender. So good punishment is swift. Another characteristic of punishment, according to Beccaria, is that punishment has to be certain. The punishment needs to be an inevitable consequence of the crime. That if someone does the crime, they should expect the punishment. And that's a very critical component of good punishment. And thirdly, the punishment has to be proportionate. Have you ever heard the phrase, let the punishment fit the crime? Well, that comes from Beccaria. And the idea is that the punishment can't be too harsh and it can't be too light. The punishment has to just exceed the benefits. Because if the punishment is too light, obviously, you're going to have more crime. Like if the penalty for burglary was a $5 fine, any rational person who expected to net more than $5 in a burglary would go ahead and burglarize if their model of human nature is correct. But by the same token, if we say, well, burglary is a serious crime and we're going to have the penalty of death for burglary, then if I was a burglar and I broke into someone's house and unbeknownst to me they were home, and it turns into a home invasion, what would I probably do? I mean, I'm there to burglarize, but I found the people home. Well, a rational burglar would probably kill the inhabitant. Penalty for burglary is death, and the penalty for murder is death. You've already committed a capital crime. And if you are a rational burglar, according to their model of human nature, then you would have no disincentive to kill the people inside the house. So perversely, punishments that are too harsh lead to more crime. So it's sort of like the Goldilocks punishment, that it has to be just right, not too harsh, not too light. Now, I go through Beccaria's idea of punishment with students, and they often say, well, that makes perfect sense, or no duh, or did I pay tuition to hear this? I mean, Beccaria's ideas seem so trite and trivial, but what you don't understand is that in Beccaria's day, these were radical ideas. They don't seem radical to us now because they're completely and fully accepted. But in Beccaria's day, this was a very unorthodox and new way to look at the world. Right? In Beccaria's day, the leading theory for why someone committed criminal acts or behaved in an antisocial manner is because they were possessed by Satan, or they practiced witchcraft, or they had a demon in them. And now I want you to think about the kinds of social policies that would follow if you lived in a society where the prevailing theory for why people commit crime is because they're possessed by the devil or possessed by a demon. Now think for a minute about the kinds of things that leaders would impose on the citizenry if they truly believed that that was the crime problem and they wanted to control crime. So one method that was common in colonial America was trial by ordeal. And when people were accused of crime, they were often tortured. And the idea was that you would torture someone accused of crime, and if they're innocent, God will give them the strength to endure the torture. But if they're possessed by a demon, or if they're under the influence of the devil, then they'll confess. And of course, after they're confessed, then they are burned at the stake or some other horrible punishment. And Beccaria said this is a bad idea because it allows, in his words, the robust scoundrel to go free and the weak to be convicted. So Beccaria really sort of challenging the religious authorities of the day and saying, no, let's not blame it on the devil. There's probably something else going on here. Another common method used for the criminal justice system was something called the ducking stool, where you tie someone to a chair who's been accused of witchcraft or malfeasance, and you lower the chair into the river or a lake, and you hold the person underwater for a long time. And if they come up alive, well, then no one could hold their breath that long unless they were possessed by a demon. So take them off to be burned at the stake. If they died, well, they were innocent. And you can see why, for a reformer like Beccaria, this is unacceptable, and why his ideas were radical ideas at the time, even though they're not particularly radical today. He was attempting to insert logic and reason into the criminal justice system. And Beccaria's views, this idea of cost-benefit analysis, is the centerpiece of the idea of deterrence in criminal justice today. Specific deterrence is that you threaten punishment to individuals so that they won't commit a crime, or if you punish them, that they won't do it again. And general deterrence is when you make the whole society aware that if you do X, the punishment will be Y, so you better not do it. Right? The whole point of the sex offender registry is mostly to scare people away from committing these horrible sex offenses because the punishment is awful. And so, regardless of whether or not you have any sort of inclination for those kinds of crimes, you better think twice before you act on those inclinations if you have them. Right? And this is also in philosophy called utilitarianism. This idea of cost benefit is often used in economics and political science. And this is the sort of model of human nature that is presently used by the criminal justice system. The idea that people are rational, that they choose crime, and that what will keep them from committing crime is the threat of punishment, that you can raise the costs of crime with punishment. Now, these days, people in the criminal justice system are quite a bit more sophisticated, and they have other ways of playing with the calculus. Remember, it's just benefits minus cost, and if the sum is negative, then there isn't going to be crime, and so you could raise costs through punishment, but there are other ways of doing it too. You can lower the benefits or the perceived benefits of crime as well. So there are all sorts of ways that the criminal justice system and people working with the criminal justice system play with this calculus to try and prevent or deter crime, and this all is based on this model of human nature and this model of criminal decision making that was presented here by Beccaria. So a common deterrent strategy is something called target hardening, where you raise the costs of crime not through punishment, but by making targets harder to hit. So, to the extent that you have a big thick door with a big heavy deadbolt on it, your house is harder to break into. To the extent that you have a strong padlock on your storage shed, it will be harder to break into. To the extent that you have a high-tech alarm on your car, it will be harder to steal. So these kinds of things are not punishment, but they raise the costs of crime because it makes it harder to commit a crime against a target that's hardened. All right? So something as simple as having well-lighted streets compared to dark streets. If you can't hide in the shadows, it's going to be harder to mug people. And so well-lighted streets can affect people's decisions about whether or not they're going to commit a crime. In my neighborhood, if someone's walking down the street at night, I can hear them walk down the street as my neighbor's dogs go off one by one as they pass down the street, because the dogs pretty much figure, hey, somebody shouldn't be walking down the street at this time of night, and they go off, and I can hear them go down the street till they get in front of my house when my dog goes off. So when you have a neighborhood where everybody has a dog, the dog is going to hear things that people don't hear, and it makes it riskier to try and break into someone's house. So the dog is for target hardening. In the state of Florida, you never know who's got a gun. You're going to break into somebody's house. Far more people down here are armed than would be armed in a state like Massachusetts or Rhode Island, and you would probably take that into account. Right? So target hardening simply means that you raise the costs or the perceived costs of crime by making targets harder to hit. I have a picture here of these dye bombs that they put on clothes. And they put these things on clothes, and you can shoplift the clothes if you want. I mean, they don't have any kind of theft protection, but you can't use the item once you take it out. Some of them are filled with dye, and if you break them off without the tool that takes them off, it will cover the clothes with dye. So all of these kinds of things. You can steal somebody's iPhone if you want to use it without their Apple ID. So these are ways to mess with the calculus without actually dealing with punishment. But a strange thing happens here. There's an interesting side effect that has been noted. And this is sometimes called crime displacement. It's sort of the push-down, pop-up theory of crime. And that is when you suppress one kind of crime with target hardening, or when you pay attention to one kind of crime and lower the perceived benefits of crime, there'll often be a very interesting phenomenon where crime will be displaced into a different type of crime. So, for instance, when I was a kid, cars didn't have alarms. And you had these posts on the doors where you locked them and unlocked them, and you could easily, if you locked yourself out of your car, you could easily get yourself back in with a coat hanger. Cars were a lot easier to steal than they are now. And so cars got stolen. In fact, there was really no sort of sense of protecting the car's property. My parents used to leave the keys to the car in the car. Right? If the keys are in the ignition, then you never lose your keys. But of course it makes it very easy to steal your car. Someone just gets in and fires it up and drives away. So they had all kinds of public service announcements about locking your car and taking your keys, and car alarms, which are now pretty much standard on every car, used to be an expensive luxury item, and they started making cars harder and harder and harder to steal. And it was effective, because the odds of any given car being stolen these days is lower than it was 30, 40 years ago. But an interesting thing happened when we made cars hard to steal. A new kind of crime was invented along about the mid-90s, when car alarms started becoming standard, when cars started to be harder to break into. A new type of crime that no one had ever heard of anymore. So take a second and think of what that category of crime might be. See if you... Of course, I'm talking about a crime called carjacking. And carjacking is a particular kind of robbery where you stick a gun in someone's face and steal their car. Like, the motive behind a carjacking is to steal a car. Now, in the old days, you didn't need to hold somebody up to steal their car. You just got in it and drove away. Or at worst, you had to use a coat hanger to pick the lock, and you could hotwire it and drive away. And the idea is that if there is a certain segment of the population that is motivated to steal cars, if you've taken away an easy route to stealing a car, the only route left is to stick a gun in someone's face. That carjacking as a crime wouldn't exist if cars were still easy to steal. Now, that's a weird thought, right? That making cars hard to steal, which we think would be a good thing, of carjacking, which is a far more serious crime, a crime where you can easily imagine something going very, very wrong in the commission of that crime. But carjacking came to be because car burglaries and car thefts got just that much harder. The same kind of thing is true for burglary generally. Burglary, when I was a kid, there was not much awareness of burglary. We never locked the front door. My mom never locked the front door. When I came home from school, I just opened the door and went in. There was no such thing as neighborhood watch. The streets were dark. There was a public awareness of how to prevent burglaries. And, long about the time I was getting to be a teenager, they started saying, okay, if you get the newspaper, back in those days, the newspaper was delivered in the morning and they would put it on your porch. And so if you went away on vacation, you could tell who was gone on vacation by the newspaper stacked on the porch. And so public service announcement came out saying, look, have someone get your paper for you so it's not obvious that you're not home. Have someone pick up your mail. Get a deadbolt lock and lock your doors. And establish a neighborhood watch and look out for each other. Harder to burglarize houses. Make it so that people report suspicious behavior. And that's exactly what happened. Public awareness of burglary rose. The targets got hardened. And it became harder and harder to burglarize homes. People started buying home alarms. Thing happened. The burglary rate stabilized, sure. But what happened was the robbery rate went up. So imagine that there are people that are motivated to steal from you, and what they would like to do is enter your house while you're at work and go through your stuff and take a few things. But because you've made that impossible, now what happens is I have to hold a knife to you or stick you up with a gun and steal from you, because there's no way to get into your house when you're not home. Making your house safer put your body at greater risk. A rise in robbery can be explained by the fact that burglaries are harder to commit. So that's a really weird idea about deterrence. The idea that there is a certain energy for crime, and that crime is like a balloon where if you push in one side, it'll come out the other side, or sort of like a pop-up push-down where if you press on one side of it and the other side pops up, and it's like a game of whack-a-mole. And that this notion that if you make cars hard to steal, then you end up with carjacking. And if you make burglary more difficult, then you end up with... So here are two examples of this. On the right, you'll see a headline here, and it says, Afghanistan meth trade surges as Taliban clamps down on heroin. So for many decades, Afghanistan was the epicenter of poppy production in the world, and a great percentage of the world's heroin supply originated in Afghanistan. And apparently recently, the Taliban has taken a dim view of this, and they have started to clamp down on heroin production. And of course, if there are people who are motivated to make money through drug sales, they just find another way. And in this instance, they started building meth labs. So you apply pressure, you use police resources to attempt to suppress one illicit substance, and another one pops up. And we see that in the United States. We went from a crack epidemic in the 80s and early 90s to a meth epidemic, and now we're in the midst of an opiate epidemic. And as we have cramped down on street heroin, people have started to abuse prescription opiates. And of course, the idea is, and a criticism of deterrence theory is that it's never going to end. Like if there is demand for these drugs, there will be a supplier for these drugs, and it doesn't matter. Criminal penalties are incredibly stiff for these crimes, but people still do them. And so this is the beginning of where sociologists start to say, now wait a second. It is pretty clear that at a certain level, people do weigh costs and benefits when they act, but it doesn't explain everything, because there are sort of things that are happening that you wouldn't really predict from deterrence theory. And one is this idea of crime displacement. Another example here is this house on the left, and this is a house in my wife's neighborhood, where my wife grew up in Puerto Rico. She's from Fajardo in eastern Puerto Rico. And when I first went to Puerto Rico, I was astounded to see that everybody's house is a fortress. Even working class people who don't have a lot of money have invested thousands of dollars in metal grates to cover their doors and windows. Every house in Puerto Rico is a fortress. The house that my wife was raised in, like this house, it is completely covered in bars and gates. And then if you were to somehow manage to get your way inside the house, there's a huge iron door in the hall that separates the bedrooms from the living room and the kitchen. So even if an intruder got into the front of the house, they'll have another iron door to contend with. And I thought this was interesting, and I talked to a lot of people there about it, and they all say the same thing. Like, the reason why the houses are built to be impregnable is because of a fear of crime in the streets. But if I was explaining it from the standpoint of this idea of crime displacement, I'd say the only place that crime can be is in the streets. Now, granted, you've made your home incredibly safe. I would sleep well at night in that house. But if there is a certain energy for crime, and that energy is constant, then that energy is going to be out in the streets. And it is a fact that Puerto Rico has relatively high rates of robbery, even if it is hard to burglarize. And so you have an interesting dilemma here. And this is one of the reasons why sociologists will say, look, this idea of deterrence, this classical theory, this rational choice theory, is a little bit incomplete. It's incomplete because of this idea of crime displacement, and it's incomplete because of the nature of how we supply punishment, particularly here in the United States. Now remember that according to Beccaria, effective punishment has three characteristics. It has to be swift, and it has to be certain, and it has to be proportionate. So let's take these in order. Is punishment in the United States swift? I don't think it is. If you, for example, were arrested for a burglary, or if you were arrested for a robbery, or if you were arrested for passing a bad check or forging a prescription, you could conceivably wait a year or more for your day in court. You might be quickly arraigned and given a bail hearing, but after that there would be a variety of delays and continuances until you finally got your day in court. And if you wanted to drag it out, you could drag it out for years. It sometimes takes years for these to reach the punishment phase. So that doesn't work according to Beccaria. Punishment in the United States is is not swift. And if we were to make it swifter, we would be impinging on due process. The second and the most important thing is that Beccaria says that punishment needs to be certain. Now, is punishment in the United States certain? No, it is not. It is not certain. Now, in order to read this slide, you may have to be on a computer with a fairly high-resolution monitor. But these are a map of the United States, and these are states, and it shows the percentage of burglaries that result in an arrest. And as you can see, even in the states with the highest rates of arrest per burglary, Delaware 24%, Maryland 18%, Connecticut 22%, between 3/4 and 4/5 of burglars are never arrested. Think of how many people that you might know whose house was broken into and yet nobody was arrested. And so part of the problem with punishment in the United States is it's hard to catch criminals when they commit these crimes. These crimes are relatively easy to get away with. Like, you might know how easy it is to get away with a burglary because you're not the kind of person that's inclined to commit one. But burglars know that it's relatively easy to get away with burglary. And if the punishment isn't certain, then it doesn't matter how much you threaten someone with punishment, because what ends up happening is that they're not risking the cost of the punishment. They're saying, I don't think I'm going to get caught. So in the benefit minus the cost to them is zero, whether or not they are effectively getting the risk of getting caught or not. If they don't think they're going to get caught, then as far as they're concerned, it greatly diminishes the cost. And this is part of the problem that you see, that criminals focus on the benefits of crime and they minimize the costs of crime. They're people who have a different risk calculus than you and me. And if that's the case, if criminals are people who have a tolerance for risk that most people don't have, then you're going to have a real hard time deterring them because they just don't think that they're going to get caught. So I made this little graph to sort of illustrate the diminishing returns of deterrence theory. Now, we're not going to completely discount the idea of deterrence because it obviously exists, right? But we'll show how deterrence has limited effectiveness in diminishing returns because, I contend, people don't really do these cost-benefit analyses the way deterrence theory needs them to do. So on the vertical axis, the y-axis, we have a hypothetical crime rate measured from low crime rates to high crime rates. And on the x-axis, we have punishments for these crimes, ranging from the lightest punishment to the most severe punishment. So imagine, given that we've used burglary as the example, imagine that we decide that our penalty is a $100 fine. That would be the bar on the extreme left of the graph. If the penalty for burglary was a $100 fine, anybody who thought they could steal more than $100 worth of stuff would do it. So let's say we say to ourselves, well, that didn't work out. We have a massive wave of burglaries. Let's change the punishment from a $100 fine to a year in jail. Now, I think that would substantially cut down on burglaries, don't you? I mean, a year in jail, that's no joke. But, you know, the penalty for burglary can be more than a year in jail now, and we still have lots of burglaries. So it doesn't deter everyone. So if we say to ourselves, well, we're going to make the punishment even more severe, let's change the punishment from 1 year to 5 years. I think there would be a drop in crime, burglaries, but it wouldn't be the kind of drop that we would anticipate, because most people would say to themselves, if they were actually factoring in the cost of the punishment, they would say, it's very unlikely that a particular burglary or series of burglaries is going to be worth 1 year of my freedom. I mean, how much money would someone have to give you in exchange for a year in jail? Probably a lot more than you could net in burglaries. So quintupling that to 5 years, there would still be people who would say, I'm still going to do it because they're saying, I don't think I'm going to get caught. Like, I'm not going to risk it for 1 year unless I think I'm not going to get caught. But if I don't think I'm going to get caught, I will. Same for 5 years. If we doubled the penalty then from 5 years to 10 years, we'd see even less of an increase, because no one's going to say, oh, you know, the burglaries that I can net are worth 5 years in prison, but not 10 years in prison. Clearly, at a certain point, you have diminishing returns, all the way till you start saying 20 years, 30 years in prison. At a certain point, there are people that are saying, I don't think I'm going to get caught. So whatever punishment you threaten me with, it's not going to stop me from burglarizing because I don't think you're going to catch me. So there needs to be a sweet spot here. And remember, Beccaria said that punishment should be proportionate. And what we've done in the United States is we've traded proportionate punishment for severe punishment. We've tried to scare the hell out of people with incredibly harsh long prison terms. We imprison people for a long time. The criminal penalties are quite severe. But it's not going to work ultimately because people are aware of the fact that they're unlikely to get caught for their crimes. So in this instance, I'm saying that deterrence has some effect. It does work. For instance, there are lots of people now who might be inclined to smoke marijuana who don't smoke marijuana because they're worried that they'll get in trouble, or they don't want to buy it illegally, they don't want to possess it illegally. But if the law changes and marijuana becomes legal, then they would use it. And so they're deterred from smoking marijuana, but clearly there are lots of people who are not deterred. So I would say that deterrence has some effect. And so what we're going to do in this class is sort of look at the shortfall between what the criminal justice system constituted sort of tells you about the nature of human behavior and what we actually see. I put a red line on this graph because that is a sort of a linear decline in crime that you would expect if it is the case that people do a straight rational cost benefit analysis that way. As a matter of fact, I don't think that people are rational in a lot of things that they do. Right? Think about how many times you've heard somebody say something like this. Oh, I know he's so bad for me, but I just can't stop seeing him, right? Or I know, she's a horrible person and she lies and cheats, but I just can't quit. People fall in love with people that are bad for them all the time. People stay in relationships that are toxic and gross all the time. That's not rational behavior. There's over the age of 5 in this country who doesn't know that smoking is bad for their health, but people start smoking every year. So people are not rational in the way that they behave. And maybe in a perfect world they would be. Maybe if we had some sort of system where if people do something wrong, sort of it's observed by some sort of computer or whatever, and a hammer comes down and hits them on the head. Right? Some sort of perfect punishment, then we would have deterrence. By the way, this is why religion is such a powerful tool of social control, because even if the police don't see you, God can see you. So if you can get people to believe that things that are criminal are also sinful, then you can really deter people from committing criminal acts, because even if they're not worried about the police catching them, they know that God will catch them because they can't hide from God. So I guess the perfect observer and the perfect provider of deterrence, if that's the kind of thing that you believe in. I remember when my kids were little, it was easy to get them to behave in December because we would, threaten them with Santa Claus, right? What does Santa Claus brings? A lump of coal to bad kids. And the thing about Santa Claus is he sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake. That's creepy as hell, but it is a highly effective parenting tool. So, we're going to take a look at the things that exist beyond this sort of rationality and look at the ways that people behave that are socially constructed in ways that aren't cost-benefit. And, frankly, I'm glad we don't live in a cost-benefit world. Right? Think about what the world would be like if everyone was a rational calculating engine. Right? If murder were legal, would you kill someone? Most of us would not do that because we just wouldn't be able to live with ourselves as a murderer. I see lots of merchandise that I could steal. I remember one time a guy got up we were at the beach, and a guy got up at a restaurant and his wallet fell out of the pocket of his cargo shorts, and my son grabbed it and chased him down the sidewalk and said, "Sir, it's your wallet." And we could have kept the wallet. Why didn't we keep the wallet? Perfectly, nobody would have seen or nobody would have known, and we could have had access to whatever money was in there. It's, I don't steal. My son doesn't steal. We don't do things like that. You don't do things like that because your mom taught you the difference between right and wrong. And so you don't go into a situation thinking to yourself, oh, I'm going to commit all these, I'm inclined to commit all these crimes, but I'm not going to do it because I'm worried about the punishment. No, it doesn't even occur to you to commit those crimes because you've been properly socialized, because you've internalized norms. It's also the case that, I don't think most criminals know what the laws are. When I was in graduate school, that's when ATMs first started to a cash machine where the bank didn't have to be open. You could get out cash. And early ATMs were popular sites for robberies, of course, because everybody leaving the ATM has cash. And so the New Jersey state legislature passed a law that doubled the criminal penalties for a robbery within 100 feet of an ATM. Now, how many potential robbers do you think are aware of the laws that the New Jersey state legislature is passing? Probably not many. How many of them do you think were pacing off 100 feet saying to themselves, okay, right here at 101, that's where I'm going to rob this guy if he comes this way? No. And people don't know the laws. Ask your neighbors, what's the criminal penalty for possession of cocaine? What's the criminal penalty for burglary? What's the criminal penalty for forging a prescription for an opiate drug? I mean, they don't know what the penalties are, and neither do the people who commit most of these crimes. And so even if they make these cost-benefit analyses, they don't have the information to do it. So we are going to embark on a discussion of the ways that sociologists look at bad behavior and the construction of bad behavior. And as you'll see, it fits nicely with the things that we've talked about the criminal justice system and this deterrence theory, because deterrence is there, it does work, but it's only part of the story. So let's tell the rest of the story in the next part.